All right, kia ora everyone. Welcome. I'm going to get us going with a karakia and then introduce Julia Ngapo, who is our guest today for the kōrero. So karakia timatanga. Mana kitea teine hui, mana kitea teine rupu, mana kitea teine whānau. Tai noa ki teine kaupapa. Arahina na kōrero, arahina na patai, arahina na ture nei, kia puta ai te maramatanga. Amine. Welcome, everybody. We have Julia Ngapo with us here today. Julia is a trauma-informed business and mindset coach for women who are used to holding everything together and keep things going, often at the expense of their own well-being. Julia's work looks at how past experiences, including trauma, can quietly shape confidence, holding boundaries, and the way we lead and impact the way we show up. So, as part of her business and mindset coaching, Julia helps her clients understand and shift their default patterns, which impact how they show up and lead. And through this, helps them experience a different kind of freedom, one that allows them to run their business with more clarity, self-trust, and ease. So today we're looking forward to hearing Julia share her journey about becoming a business and mindset coach, and why she is passionate about supporting women in business, unravel and better understand their own history of trauma, and show up in better ways that not only serve others, but also serve themselves and, allow them to take care of their own well-being. So Julia will share with us what it means to be trauma-informed when coaching someone and how we can support those around us using trauma-informed coaching. So welcome, Julia. Really, really excited to have you with us.
Thank you. It's
Um,
lovely to be here with you.
yes, look, I would love to hear a little more about you. Welcome to introduce yourself. But I am really curious about how you arrived at becoming a trauma-informed coach, where your passion comes from in terms of specifically supporting women in business. It's really amazing as I've sort of grown in this space and I've learned in the space of becoming trauma informed and, becoming more relationally aware about how we show up with others, engage with others. It's been interesting how there's different areas and aspects of lives and sectors that are now starting to become more and more trauma informed. So what does it mean to be, trauma informed in coaching? How did you get there? What drove you there? On to you.
Thank you. My path, I guess, was fairly convoluted, fairly sort of like that. I think when I first sort of came out of compulsory education, as all naive young people do, I thought that life would be very much sort of like that. And of course, it isn't, it wasn't. So I started by studying law. And then I moved into legal marketing and worked my way up to director of a multinational, multi-million pound legal publishing business. And from there, I moved to, I was there for, initially, it was going to be a sort of 6 month gig. And that lasted 10 years. I then sort of left that role and set up my own digital marketing agency. And I got to the stage, I got to what I describe with my clients as a crossroads. And I think it's common to an awful lot of women at different stages of their life, that point of, okay, so this is it. This is where I am now. Where do I go from here? Is this it?
Mm.
And the trigger for me was the fact that my two children had grown up and flown the nest. And as some of us will know, that sort of puts a whole,
Yeah.
gives us a whole new perspective, that whole sort of empty nesting thing. And that sort of, from that point, I decided that I enjoyed the bit of the digital marketing that I enjoyed was actually the strategizing. Because I use an analogy, and I am the queen of analogies. I use them all the time, different ones. But the analogy that I like to use is that it's a bit like a plate of spaghetti. A client comes with a plate of spaghetti, figuratively, and they want the spaghetti is their business, and they want a strategy at the end of it. And it's a case of sort of finding the end and teasing it out and creating a strategy from that. And of course, it's sort of marketing is fairly holistic because it involves all different aspects of the business. So I
Mm,
wasn't really just focusing solely on their marketing. It was bringing in all the other aspects of their business. And that sort of caused me to evaluate, as I say, where I was and to do a sidestep into coaching, business coaching. I went away and retrained. I did a master's degree in senior executive coaching and mentoring, bit of a mouthful. And then I set up in business. I was living in the UK at the time, set up in business and ran my coaching practice there for almost 10 years before we moved to New Zealand 2 years ago.
wow.
My husband, as you might guess from the surname, my husband is a Kiwi. Um, so yeah, we moved over here. So I've sort of restarted my business, re-established my business. Um, and yeah, so I now work with women in established businesses. I help them to I work with women who are already in, as I say, in that established business. They've got clients, they've got regular income, but they're constrained by something. They may not know what it is that constrains them, but
Mm,
they know that there is something, and they're
yeah,
curious perhaps to see what more they could be or do or achieve.
mm,
So my work sits in the sweet spot, if you like, between the woman and the business. So my coaching starts, so most coaching starts with strategy, as we know. Um, Mine starts with the patterns underneath
mm,
the way that people, women behave.
mm,
And that's generally a bit of a dig beneath the surface, because what we do find is that the original challenge, if you like, that
mm,
somebody presents when they come to work with me is not really what's going on. It's deeper than that. So it's the deep work around that. And I also did further training in a trauma-informed approach, training sponsored by the ICF, the International Coaching Federation, because what we often find is that the initial challenges, which may seem quite mundane, not mundane, that's the wrong word, but quite sort of ordinary in a way, things
mm,
like how women price, how they price themselves and their time, how they negotiate, how they set boundaries. It's not as random as it often seems. Those approaches that they have been shaped somewhere.
mm,
Um, in actual fact, I don't need to know where, but I help them with how those patterns are showing up in their life now.
mm,
Um, what I think is a useful distinction to make is that I'm not a therapist. People
mm,
tend to think that, when you mention trauma, that there is some therapy involved. That's not, I'm ethically not allowed to therapize my client. Those are not the skills that I have. But what I do is look at how the patterns that they've
mm,
learnt, the neural pathways in their brain that have shaped who they are and what they are and how they do it over however many years of their life. And some of them, these patterns come from way, way, way back in childhood.
Yeah.
Um, I work with how those patterns show up in life today,
Yeah.
and how we can clear away those blocks so that and the result is strength building,
Mm,
and clarity, really. And that self-awareness is just key in everything. If we know what we're doing and why we're doing it,
yeah.
then we stand a better chance of changing than we do if we're just sort of doing something blindly, as it were.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, Julia, you mentioned about patterns that we carry, and a lot of them are shaped, through those life experiences. Some of them are, negative, some are positive. And of course, trauma impacts, the patterning and sort of wiring, so to speak, of the nervous system. In your experience, what are some of those common patterns that you have noticed women tend to carry when they're working in, you know, business environments? And I think the reason why I'm asking you this is because the business environment is quite specifically more competitive, more, um, I guess, focused, whereas a lot of women who are in sort of the caregiving kind of roles or sectors, it's a completely different aspect. And personally, for me, as someone who's been a lot, connected and experienced in the caregiving sector, I am now aware of the kind of patterns that women will bring into the space, the trauma responses that we tend to carry around. In the business space, what are those patterns that you tend to see and notice
Yeah.
women carrying?
So some of the really common ones are hypervigilance. Um, and we dress it up. We don't sit and say, well, I'm hypervigilant. What we say is that I'm very thorough. I check, what we do is we check and we recheck,
Yeah,
but it's never really about quality control. It's
yeah,
about the fact that we have learned somewhere not to trust
yeah,
ourselves.
yeah.
We've been taught, and we mentioned in childhood. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of different types of trauma, and I think it's important to just note that when we think of trauma, we perhaps tend to think of it as being the big things, perhaps bereavement and or accidents or injury and those sorts of things, but it doesn't necessarily have to be those. There are different types of trauma. We can have trauma from um, cultural expectations. We can have trauma from, as I say, growing up. When we're a child around the age of 5 to 7, we are literally like a sponge. And we absorb all the things that are said and the things that we see, and our brain interprets that and can sometimes sort of use those against us. So when I'm working with women, some of the patterns that I'm seeing are really, really entrenched in there. If you've got a woman of,
Mm,
let's say, 45, 50,
mm,
that's, 40 or 50 years
yeah,
of having that belief.
yeah,
So as you say, as to answer your question, hypervigilance is one.
yeah.
Um, it can be the old fear, fight, flight, or fawn
Mm,
signal. The people pleasing, where we take on too much
yeah.
work. Somebody asks us to do something at work, and instead of saying, no, I can't, we say, yeah, yeah, I can do that. I think we've probably all done it at some stage or
Yes.
another. Um, over delivering, discounting before we're even asked to
Mm,
give a reduction. Um, that sort of thing. It all comes back to those old patterns.
mm,
Being indecisive, overthinking things. Again, that's that freeze, that other part of the signal. A bit like being a rabbit in headlights. You don't know which way to go, so you stay stationary. But the problem is, the real difficulty is that from the outside, this sort of behavior very often looks like competence. It
mm,
looks like, and I know this because this is something that what I didn't say in my introduction is that the reason why I do what I do, why I work in this area, is because I grew up the product of a narcissistic mother. And she, God bless her, gave me an awful lot of material to work through. Um, and so I do understand from, a first person point of view, if you like, what it is like to struggle with people pleasing and with fear of visibility and feeling that you need to stay quiet because it wasn't you weren't in a safe environment as a
mm,
child to speak or you weren't heard, you didn't feel heard. So as I say, it's really hard, can be really hard to catch those patterns, and they can be really deeply entrenched. Um,
mm.
but the cost can be huge. And there is a difference between carrying on as you have for however many years and trying to sort of go over the blocks, under the blocks, around the blocks, or getting to the point where you say, no, I'm going to do something about this and actually clearing the blocks away. Because as we know, I could sit and I could write a strategy that would help you to use your time more efficiently, to be more productive. I could sit here and I could talk about the Eisenhower matrix, which is a common coaching tool. And a lot of coaches would talk about that and would give you that tool. But at the end of the day, it's not the productivity is a symptom rather than the the original cause. So I
Mm,
sort of look at the cause rather than the symptoms and get that knocked out of the way so that you can build
yeah.
into a much healthier position, much better place.
That makes so much sense. Those beliefs we carry about ourselves. More recently, I've been really trying to work on, um, some of these things that you've talked about, and one of them was that hypervigilance. I have to be perfect, and I would spend so much time on, checking emails and checking spellings. And, having a spelling mistake was something that I felt, would make me look unprofessional. And I've had to really talk to myself about how a spelling mistake is not going to,
Yes,
be the end of it all for me. I can make spelling mistakes. It's okay to make spelling mistakes. You don't have to check and recheck. It's all right. And it's really, really hard to let go of some of these patterns that are embedded in us because they're just everyday habits for us.
yes.
Um, so you mentioned self-awareness is really important. Having that clarity and, strength building is something that you work on. But once you've got the self-awareness, how do you then break some of these patterns and habits that are embedded and that are so entrenched in you for so many years? What is it that helps us shift and break those patterns? What are some of the strategies that you use to help break those patterns?
Yeah. Um, I, I think. it's also important, just going back slightly to what you were saying there about that need for perfectionism. That's always an interesting one, perfectionism, because we strive for it. We think, as you say, that we need to be perfect. But in actual fact, perfection doesn't exist because it relies on the actions of others. And whilst we can control our own acts and behavior and responses and all that, we can't control other people. So we're actually striving for something that we're never going to achieve anyway. To answer your question, change on a basic level, change happens through repetition. Insight is great. Insight is the first step.
Mm.
But and that's the interesting part, if you like, from mine and the client's point of view, I guess. But it's the repetition that actually creates the rewiring of the brain. It's creating that new neural pathway because there are so many things we do in life that we do on autopilot. I mean, when was
Yeah.
the last time you sat and thought, I really must blink now, or I really must breathe? We don't. We do it on autopilot because our brain has set up the rules that say that every 1 second or whatever it is, we have to breathe, we have to take in a breath and what have you, and we have to blink to lubricate our eyes and all the rest of it. Um, so a lot of what we do is we do without even thinking about it, and that's the same with the habits that we create. Because a thought that we have becomes a belief, and a belief then becomes an action, and an action becomes a habit. And it's a little bit like coming across a field of long grass and walking from one corner to the opposite corner. The first time you do that, if you came back the next day, the grass that you'd trodden down would have re
Mm.
positioned itself, re-sprung up, whatever the word is, and the path would have disappeared. But if you repeatedly walked that path every day for a week, then that path would be trodden into the grass and it would become established. And that's exactly the same principle that works in our brain with our neural pathways. We have to intercept the thought or the pattern at the time of doing.
Yeah.
We then create that insight into what we were doing and why were we doing it that way.
Mm.
Because often we sort of have this subconscious view that we're doing it this way because that's the only way it can be done. I've worked with hundreds of people, and I have to say probably more men than women have a view that, well, this is the way we've always done it, so therefore this is the only way.
Mm.
And woe betide anybody who comes in. You hear the stories, don't you, of people in companies, the youngster who comes in with the, all singing, all dancing,
Yeah.
newfangled way of doing something, which cuts the time involved in two. And they get short shrift by the senior people
Mm.
who've always done it that way. Um, so it's about that repetition. It's about creating that new neural pathway and about being open to changing the way that we do things.
Mm.
Because nothing is, change is rarely fatal. If something doesn't work, we change something, it doesn't work, we can go back to what we were doing before if it serves us.
Exactly.
There's nobody sort of stood over you saying you must do what I say. That's not
Yeah.
how it works. Um, so those habits, those new habits, get embedded in small and specific moments. They're not sort of
Mm.
dramatic, ta-da moments. They're just those small steps that add up to a change. And once we create that change, when we repeat it, then it gets embedded in our brain, a new neural pathway gets created, and then it becomes the norm.
Okay. Um, I'm just wondering, in terms of um, helping to identify those dysfunctional patterns that you talked about, what is your process? What is sort of the coaching process that you use um, to help unpack some of those or identify some of those, dysfunctional or harmful patterns that have been entrenched? Um, how do you go about that?
It really depends on how the client presents, the particular sort of challenges that they've got. But I usually start with some form of self-regulation. And I guess this is one of the advantages of being trained in coaching because I
Mm.
don't know if you're aware, but coaching is still non-regulated. So anybody can wake up tomorrow morning and decide
Yeah.
that they're going to be a coach and go out and start, working with people. And that doesn't always follow that those people are doing it in an ethical way. And that's one thing that I thank my training for, in that it's given me, it means that I have at my disposal, if you like, so many different tools and modalities. I'm a master practitioner in neurolinguistic programming, and I also use cognitive behavioral therapy and different modalities that can be adapted to however the client presents. Um, but as I say, it usually starts with some form of self. If they're under particularly chronic stress, for example, it'll start with self-regulation. That might be breath work. It's about sort of the grounding that person, because what happens when we get into that stressful state is that we tend to go into that fear, fight, flight, or freeze, fight, flight, or fawn mode. And we start catastrophizing. We start um, surveying getting our sort of 360-degree goggles on and looking, perceiving our world around us as dangerous and scary, and it puts us into this sort of spiral. So if I can ground that person down,
Mm.
uh, so that it's half the battle done, really. And we might use tools like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, where it's sort of 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, and it goes through the senses. That's a really good grounding tool, because I do come across, clients do come, and it's usually in between sessions. I'll get a WhatsApp message or a Voxer message, and it'll be something along the lines of, "Oh my God, something, XYZ has happened, and I didn't expect it," and da 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 da. And you can just tell from the tone of voice that this person is spiraling. So that you can't make any change with that person if they're sort of somewhere up here. You've got to sort of pull them back down to earth, get them on the solid ground, as it were, and then be able to sort of to analyze what's really going on. And often you find that at that point it's not nearly as bad as the original, catastrophizing has made it seem. So we might do some sort of timeout strategies, anything that really sort of brings that person down. And that's before we go into any further strategies, because when you're in that situation, that chaos, if you
Mm.
like, you don't need somebody giving you another tool that you've got to use. You're not in any fit state to use those tools. Um, so from there, we might use some sort of cognitive tools, looking at how we can catch black and white thinking, um, how we can identify that catastrophizing, the jumping to conclusions, and the thought patterns, identifying those thought patterns that keep us stressing, when actually the thing that was stressing us has actually passed, but we're still escalated about it. And then I might use something like an NLP tool, which is called neurological levels. And that looks at what's happening for us, not on just a behavioral level,
Mm,
but on levels of belief and levels of identity. Because when we get really, really stressed in business, particularly, it's really rarely just about the workload.
mm,
It's usually about what the client believes she has to be or she has to do in order to succeed. And very often that success is somebody else's version of success, what she's been
mm,
told success is, which is
mm.
another interesting area.
That is really fascinating. When you were just saying when you are thinking about what you have to do or feeling uncomfortable with what you have to do, and it just got me thinking there are so many compromises we tend to make in life. Um, there are times when we have to do things that don't sit well with our values, and I think that's one thing I've found that I really struggle with when I have to do something that does not align with my personal values and belief systems. Um, and something that I feel is, not contributing or beneficial um, for the larger majority. And I think that's something that I've always struggled with. In terms of making those compromises in life, which we all have to, how do you support people with, what's the compromise and where do you draw those boundaries? Because you do need to set boundaries. And we often, especially women, I feel, are not very good at setting boundaries. I've actually admired women who set really clear boundaries. And this was years ago. I would think that they were being very harsh when they set boundaries. But once I actually learned what setting boundaries was, I actually realized that this is what they were doing. And it was something that I really valued and, thought, oh, I wish I could do something like that, set boundaries. And it's something I'm still learning in terms of setting boundaries. But where and how do you weigh up setting boundaries and compromising? Because that's the reality of life. You do have to compromise at times. And
Mm.
what are some of the ways that you can, or anybody can work through that, having to make decisions and choices about where do I compromise and where and
Yeah,
how do I set boundaries?
that's a really interesting question. And it's a really big one too, because that compromise, I believe, is just inherent in all women. We are brought up we're in a society where we are expected to just juggle.
Mm,
There's a lady, apologies, but I don't know which lady it was who was getting the dinner ready as she's listening to this. And we laugh about it and we talk about multitasking and we all do it. But that's an aspect of the juggling that we all do. If we've got family, we've got children, then we have to we as women wear so many hats.
mm,
The child, the parent, the partner, the caregiver,
mhm.
the down to the I don't know the PTA member, the kids' school, all these
The
different taxi
chauffeur.
driver, all these different roles that we play. And we just take it as read that actually it's us that have got to compromise, that we have to somehow shelve our wants and desires and values just to keep the peace. And we're brought
Mhm.
up often to do that. We're brought up as the peacekeepers. Um, and that is a really, it's very, very common, as I say, because I firmly believe that all women have an element of that in them. Um,
Yeah.
and so how do we, the question, sorry, was how do we deal with that, wasn't it?
Yes, and it's about where and how do we balance between setting boundaries and holding that space for ourselves and making sure we're true to our values,
Yeah,
and where do we make those compromises,
yeah,
and yeah, because I think that when you let go and compromise continually, you end up being resentful. And in the
yes,
long run, it does not actually help and support anyone, to be honest. And so setting boundaries is really important, but at the same time, making compromises in life is also. So where and how, do we make those choices and decisions around, yeah, making
yeah,
compromises and staying true to our values and setting boundaries, especially in business. Because I mean, if I'm doing it as a mother at home, it's one thing. I can decide, I've done enough, there's lots going on this, for the last few weeks. I've done enough for the kids, the home. I'm going to take time for myself, I'm doing
yeah,
something for myself. I'm not. But when you're in business and it becomes a matter of towing the line of, that whole outcomes and productivity and things like that, how and where are there some tools that reflective tools that can be used to make some of these choices and decisions about where do we compromise, or how do we move ahead and set boundaries, things like that.
yeah. I think it comes back initially, and it's a process. It comes back to that self-awareness. It comes back to looking at what you want as an individual and shelving the kids and the fact that you've got to iron somebody's shirt for tomorrow, whatever it happens to be. Put all that behind you, just to the side, and you just think about, okay, what am I? Who am I? And what do I want? What does success look like for me?
Mm-hmm.
And from there, it's a case of sort of reverse engineering it back. How do I get to that point? And one of the things that, as you say, that will come up will be invariably will be those boundaries and the lack of boundaries, because we're so used to just keeping the peace. So how you can deal, I think how the short answer of dealing with boundaries is, or establishing them, is putting yourself, we can use a tool, um, a coaching tool, which is called perceptual positioning. And all that means is that what you do is you put yourself, you think of somebody that you respect. If we're talking in a business context, perhaps there is another woman in business who you greatly respect, who you would aspire to be. It could even be somebody on the TV that you think is if I was wanting to be a great chef, I might look at Nigella Lawson because I think she's
Yeah.
ace. She's brilliant. Um, so you put yourself in the position, in the shoes of that person, and you think about what would they do? What would their answer be? How would they act? And then you take, when you've established that answer, you take that back to yourself. It's really important that you don't just think, okay, what would um, XYZ do?
Yeah.
How can I apply that to me? What could I change in my normal patterns
Yeah.
to emulate what I admire in them.
Mm.
And so it's almost like giving yourself permission to to be somebody else, but within
Mm.
your skin. And sometimes that's all we need. We just need that permission because we're taught from sometimes a very young age that we don't have the right to speak out or to act as we want to or to do what we want or all these different rules and regulations that are fostered on us from such a young
Mm.
age. And sometimes it is just about giving ourselves permission and we can sort of emulate and that. So when we get into a situation where, let's take a everyday example, somebody says to us, "Oh, you're okay staying late at work tonight to finish that project,
Mm.
aren't you?" And we really want to say no because I've got to take little Johnny to soccer practice. Or, I just want to go home and have a bath, or whatever it happens to be. We're thinking that internally, but what comes out of our mouth is, yes, yes, I can do that. And this is the behavior that I did for years of my life, sitting and taking work calls at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, things like that. But when we put ourselves into somebody else's position, I think, okay, what would X do? And how can I
Mm.
apply that to me? Then we get that permission to be able to say, well, actually, no. And we have to remember that no is a complete sentence.
Mm.
We have to, very often when we say no, we feel that we've got to over explain ourselves. And we haven't. No is a complete sentence. It's almost a
Yeah.
case of having a few stock phrases in your arsenal, your mental arsenal, if you like. So you can say that if you're not comfortable with saying no, straight off, you could sort of say, oh, well, let me just check my diary because, and that gives you that breather. It's creating that
Yeah.
moment of space so that you can marshal your thoughts
Yeah.
and then go for the no.
Yeah. Um, I think that no is a complete sentence is um something that I really struggle with. I always feel like I have to justify the no,
Totally, totally. I
or I
get it.
have to
Yeah.
earn the no in some way. Um, and yeah, it is something that I know I struggle with a lot. And in exactly what you said, taking the time before I say the no is something that has helped me because I
Yeah.
find it really hard to say no straight away.
There is an awful lot of
And
power in a pause. If you
yeah,
pause, we often our brain is set up to fill in the gaps. If you've ever had a conversation and the conversation dries up and you have that really awkward pause, which feels like eternity, but is actually really just a few seconds, and your brain is thinking, what do I say now? What can I say? What can I say? Um, your brain finds it uncomfortable to have that pause. Um, and so it can be really powerful to bring that into conversation. Um, but it gives you the chance to just, as I say, just to breathe and to take a step and think, okay, what do I really want?
yeah, yeah. That's actually a really, really useful way of working on saying the no and setting boundaries. Um, Julia, as a coach who is supporting others, help unpack those patterns, rewire themselves. Is vicarious trauma a risk for coaches, especially when you're working in this trauma-informed way and you're really helping women unpack their trauma? You yourself being a woman, having that lived experience, like you said, of, the patterning from the trauma responses that you've carried with you, is it something that you've had to deal with or you think is a risk for coaches? And I think it kind of creeps in, isn't it, if you're not self-aware. Um, I know personally in my life as someone who has been an advocate and has supported other parents, in their journey of advocating for their children or battling the discrimination.
Mm.
I didn't realize how it had crept into my life. And remember years ago, when the kids were younger, when we would have good patches and everything was going really well for my children, I would still be on edge and not feel, settled and I think at that time, now I can put it in words, and that time it just felt like something's not right. I'm really unsettled. Why am I not relaxed and happy? That's what I would tell myself, we're
Yeah.
having a good run. Why am I not just enjoying it? Why am I still agitated? And now I can understand that I was still in that fight flight because not because of my children and my personal,
That hypervigilance,
family's
isn't it?
experiences. It was the
Yeah.
ongoing thing and also the continuous stories and experiences that I was then hearing from other parents who I was trying to support and other parents who, shared. So I have realized now that I have been impacted by that as well, over the years. But as a coach who is continually helping and supporting, women to unpack their trauma, their sort of, patterning, is that something that you found a risk for you in your journey?
Yeah. It's a difficult one. Um, I would be lying if I sat here and said, no, no, I don't feel it at all. I'd have to be made of stone, I think. Um, I am highly empathic, so I have a tendency to take on other people's feelings. That hypervigilance that I grew up with means that I can walk into a room and feel the energy before a word is said, which
Mm.
sometimes is an advantage because I can beat a hasty retreat, sometimes not so much. But part of my
I love that.
coaching.
Sorry, I just have to jump in. I absolutely love that. I have never thought of it in this way because I'm the kind I would say things like, oh, I can sense the vibes when I enter a room, but I never thought that's a positive way you can, quickly make the exit. That I love
Yeah,
that. I
yeah.
love that.
I think my husband is very used to it now because we'll walk in somewhere and he'll sort of see me sort of say, "What time can we leave?" Out of the corner of my mouth. But anyway, um, part of the coach training that we undertake is something called reflective practice. And it's something that's required of coaches after every conversation that they have. And
Mm,
it's a period where you sit and reflect, as you might expect, on the conversation that you've just had. It's not at all optional, shouldn't be optional. It's part of how you work responsibly. Because if I take on
mm,
the woes and the worries, I limit myself now to coaching two clients a day. And that is for my own health and well-being. And because it takes such a lot of energy to hold space for somebody else, to be
mm,
present for somebody else, and to be actively listening and observing that person. Because I'm listening when I'm coaching somebody,
mm,
I'm listening to what they're saying, I'm also listening to what they're not saying, and I'm watching their body language. So it is all consuming, and that's really draining. If you do that, every day, 5 days
mm,
a week, multiple clients, multiple
mm,
sessions, then you're not doing yourself any good, but you're also not serving your clients. Because it becomes a conveyor belt and you are so downtrodden and it's sort of like next, next.
mm,
You can't give your best to that client.
mm,
So reflective practice, and I can't afford to carry what the client brings into the session. Um, so there is an element of me that stays deliberately detached. And it
Mm.
actually makes me laugh a little bit because sometimes when people look at coaching, they look at the cost of coaching and they think, well, what am I getting for perfectly reasonable question? What am I
Yeah.
getting for the money that I'm paying? Oh, I'm getting a 60 or a 90-minute coaching conversation every week or fortnight or whatever it is. What they don't see is the work that goes on afterwards. So I will, after every conversation, I will reflect, and I have a sort of template
Mm.
that I was given by the ICF when I qualified, which will sort of give me questions to prompt my reflection. And it'll be around sort of what did I do well? What could I have done better? How did I handle it? Were there any sticking points? And if there are some sticking points, some sticky bits where I perhaps know that I didn't handle it because I'm human. I have off days as well as anybody else.
Mm.
Bits that I think on reflection, I could have handled that better.
Mm.
Then I have the ability to go to what's called supervision
Mm.
as a coach, and that means that I sit with I take the challenges that I have
Mm.
to a coach who is specially qualified in supervising other coaches, and we thrash it out between us, and they will, listen to how I um, handled something. They might
Mm.
sometimes I record conversations. I might give them that, and they can there see what I did. They might come back and say, "You could, this is how you could have approached it." And it's all about learning because the world of coaching evolves all the time. People and work and everything is evolving so
Mm.
much all the time that we have to do that to keep abreast of it. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I'm working in a way that's not current. And
Yeah.
my clients expect, and they have a right to expect more of me than that. So short answer, I'm very good at giving long answers, I've realized. This is my reflection of tonight's Korero. But uh, it is hard sometimes not to, particularly with trauma. I've dealt with clients who have been through huge traumas, and helped them as best I can. Um, but I do have to be very mindful and stay detached
Mm.
because if I want to carry on helping them or help the next lady to walk through my doors, figuratively speaking,
Yeah.
then I can't carry the weight on
Yeah.
my shoulders.
Absolutely. And I think this is where that self-care, the self-love is so important, isn't it? Because when we are supporting somebody else, we really do have to make sure that we are caring for ourselves as well.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
and yeah, and sometimes you have to give yourself permission to put yourself first,
Yes,
instead of other people. You do need to do that.
absolutely.
Um, and it's actually really interesting because I'll be really honest, when sort of coaching started out a few years ago, I was like, how do you go about becoming a coach? Anybody becomes a coach, and why is it so expensive? You've actually answered that question
There's a lot of coaches, aren't
as
there?
well. Like, why
Yeah.
is coaching so expensive? Like, yeah, so no, that's really, really fascinating. Um, and I really do appreciate you sharing some of this because again, it's such a such a space that not everybody's aware of as
No.
well. I've got one other question before we close. What are some of the tips on having those difficult conversations in really sort of trauma-informed ways? How do we hold people accountable for their actions and also ensure that we are considerate of where they're coming from or their sort of baggage that they may be carrying,
Mm.
their trauma responses and patterns that they are bringing to the table. How do we have some of those difficult conversations?
Yeah,
where somebody's actions are actually harming, hurting, you know, impacting negatively others in an organization, in a, professional capacity. And you have to hold them accountable, but you also know and understand. I always feel that, that empathy for people, um, when I know where they're coming from, but then I don't quite know how to, you
no.
know, do the accountability part of things. So yeah, how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think what you've highlighted is absolutely correct, and it is that compassion is key. We can. I'm a firm believer in kindness, kindness in everything that we do, because I do believe in karma. I believe that what we put out comes back to us.
Yeah.
Um, so compassion, I think, in everything is a good starting point. Not sympathy, because sympathy is worthless, really, but compassion. Then I think the important thing is separating the standard from the story, because the standard doesn't move. Um,
Okay.
it's about understanding where the client is and where she's falling short, where the person is and where she's falling short. Um, so it's a conversation like, I still need that piece of work by Friday, but can you tell me what's making that hard for
Mm,
you? That sort
okay.
of conversation. So you're not trading one for the other. Um, in terms of accountability, you can still hold someone accountable and be considerate of what they're carrying at the same time. They're not opposites. They're not
Okay.
mutually exclusive. Although sometimes I get it can feel like that. Um, I think it's about how the conversation opens.
Okay.
Um, I'll name what I'm seeing quite plainly without softening it into nothing, but I'll also ask what's going on for that person before I assume. So don't assume
Okay.
anything. Let that person tell you, and
Okay.
let and don't push. You may in a work environment, you may be aware that there is something going
Mm,
on. Let's say, for example, there is something at home.
yeah.
You don't know what that something is. Um, you've got to really wait for that person, the other person, to venture or volunteer that information. It's not a case of digging, never ever a case of digging around and assuming anything, because you're likely to do more damage than good.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, assume nothing, I guess. And remember that accountability without context, if you take accountability and take the context out of it, it's just criticism.
Okay.
Context, on the other hand, without accountability is avoidance. So the best conversations have both. So you can stand firm and you can ask for accountability, but having that compassion and asking for the reasons, asking for that conversation, giving the
Mhm.
holding space for that conversation and for the openness to be there is really key.
Okay. I really like what you've said, context without the accountability is avoidance.
Yeah,
Makes so much sense. Um, yeah. Um, Look, this has been really, really interesting conversation. I honestly didn't know what it would go like today, because again, this is a new space for me, not I'm familiar with coaching, but not with coaching in the business and professional space, so to
no,
speak. So it's been really, really fascinating having this conversation with you, Julia. Um, and thank you so much for sharing, um, all the background to, how you work and things like that, because it's been really, really insightful for me. And I'm sure it'll be insightful for others as well. So really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Before we close, did you want to share anything at all in terms of how people can get touch with you, things like that? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm all over socials. Well, when I say I'm all over, I'm on Facebook and Instagram. Facebook is Julia Ngapo Coaching, and Instagram is Julia_Ngapo_coaching. And I have my website, I think, in the thank you
Yes,
for putting that
I
up.
just put that in.
Thank you. Please, I offer a 50, a 15 minutes, 30 minutes. It never ever is 15 minutes. It always goes on longer, and I'm happy for it to go on longer. But a clarity call, which is like a mini coaching session, really. It's totally free, totally no obligation. And it helps you to hopefully see where you're at and where you would like to be and determine that version of success that is right for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. I will
Thank
close
you.
us with the karakia for today. And we'll make sure we share the links and stuff
Thank you.
on Facebook and Insta. Karakia whakamutunga, kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai. Haumie, huie, tai kie. Kia ora, everyone. Pō Marie.